The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. University of Vermont professor Kim Coleman is hitting the mountain biking trails of Vancouver Island. But she's not here on vacation. Coleman is visiting Vancouver Island University for the spring semester as a Fulbright Canada Research Chair. She's studying how communities manage outdoor recreation, comparing examples on the island with some she studied back in New England. Coleman visited the CHLY studio Tuesday to talk about how communities change when mountain biking goes mainstream.
I'm Kim Coleman. I'm a professor at the University of Vermont, which is in the United States. And I chair the Parks, Rec, and Tourism program there. And I do work on all elements of people in forests. So how people make decisions about, recreate, and connect with forests. And I'm the 2025 research chair with Fulbright at Vancouver Island University. So I'm here doing comparative work, looking at replicating a study I did in northern New England here on the island and working with colleagues here and community members here and seeing what there can be learned here on Vancouver Island that's transferable back to the States.
What is that study that you did in New England that you're trying to replicate here?
Yeah, awesome question. So New England has a lot in common with Vancouver Island. And in particular, there's a part of New England that's called the Northern Forest. It actually stretches a little bit into New York and Quebec as well, which are not part of New England. So the Northern Forest is this big contiguous forest block that starts at the Atlantic Ocean, goes across northern Maine, northern New Hampshire, northern Vermont, parts of southern Quebec, and then into New York, over into Adirondack Park, which is this big protected area in New York State. It doesn't go all the way across New York. And it's a really important forest block because it's the biggest contiguous block east of the Mississippi. So we really care about what's going on there. And traditionally, there were a lot of small communities that were timber-dependent towns, very similar to here. That industry sort of collapsed in the 80s and 90s, and those communities have been hanging on ever since, have been really dependent on what we call the snow economy. So that's like winter tourism, that's visiting ski areas, downhill areas, and Nordic areas. And that's under threat because of climate change. We have really unpredictable winters now, kind of like your winter last winter. Mount Washington didn't get a lot of snow. They're doing great this year. And so many of those communities have been thinking hard about how to diversify the forest economy and keep these small, rural, forest-dependent places vibrant, right? Have enough kids to go to school, have a tax base to keep roads paved, all of that important stuff that rural communities struggle with. And after COVID, they saw an explosion of people recreating outside in these forests, and in particular, mountain biking. And there was subsequently a real concerted effort to invest in mountain bike infrastructure to attract both tourists and new residents to these places and sort of breathe new life into some of these communities and create more vibrant economies. And so some colleagues and I got really curious about how this was playing out. I'm a mountain biker myself, and I would be, riding in the woods a lot during and after COVID and think, whoa, who are all these new folks, right? And so we started doing case studies in northern New England and southern Quebec and in that part of eastern New York that's part of this region, and really starting to unpack like the good, the bad, the sort of in between, and get into the nuance of that work. And then we wanted to see how it was, playing out on the other side of the continent here in Western Canada, which also has a long history of timber-dependent communities and lots of outdoor recreation and is well known for mountain biking. What lessons could be learned here that could be shared in New England, and what lessons from New England can be shared here?
What do you know about what happened in New England, how that played out in New England when you had these communities, these maybe small rural communities that were dependent on the forest industry? The forest industry correct me if I'm wrong, isn't what it once was.
Correct, yeah.
What happened when they started to embrace outdoor recreation and getting people to come from other places to do that?
Yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag. So one community that we looked at had 7 timber mills 10 years ago, and they have 2 now. They also had this sort of Nordic ski area that had traditionally been a summer camp, and then they started grooming for Nordic skiing and were attracting tourists in that way. And that's become really unpredictable as we've not had great snow every winter. I hear they're having a great winter now when I'm not there to enjoy it. And so they really started thinking hard about the trail development, and they're commutable from Boston. So there's the potential for people to come up for long weekends and rent rooms in this, what was traditionally the summer camp, and then this Nordic outdoor touring center, and spend money in the local economy. And by and large, that has worked. They have attracted people. New businesses have started. There's a brewery that opened and then quickly needed to move because it was doing so well, and then opened a second location. So there is this influx of visitation and money being spent. There's also a lot of kids that are using the trails. And that's a real concern for a lot of these places is, do our youth think it's cool to live here? Are they going to stay, or are they going to graduate from college and go somewhere else? And so, in some ways, it really has incredible benefits. The other side is that as people move in, maybe people think, oh, I can work remotely because of COVID. And so I don't have to live in Boston. I can work remote and move to this northern place where I can live where I play. And there's enough people who are interested in doing either that or buying a second home that's really contributed to the housing crisis in many of these towns. So we heard from people in this community that, we do see the new breweries open and new jobs created. And now I have to commute from across the other state, right? This community happens to be right along a border. And I can't afford to live here. I have to live somewhere else and then commute to work. Or we heard from folks that were longtime residents that their kids wanted to buy a house in this town, but couldn't afford it. So we've seen the influx of new people really push the housing market or contribute to an already crunched housing market. And then additionally, while we have seen, great job creation, so I mentioned this community had a bunch of mills, many of them have closed. The businesses that mountain biking has supported have tended to be service industry jobs, right? This is essentially adding to the tourist industry. And the folks that traditionally worked in a timber mill, they made pretty good money in those positions. They're not going to make that same type of living working in the service industry, and many of them frankly don't want to. So it has been a mix of benefit and tension, and not outright conflict, but certainly growing pains that we would associate with an influx of people to any small place.
When you study that, what is the goal? What do you come away with, and how does what you come away with factor into some kind of change or understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're hoping that the results from our work help inform rural recreation planning. So in town planning as well, and rural amenities management. In the case of northern New England, this has been a real concerted effort, right? We're strategically investing in outdoor rec infrastructure in many communities. And so those are conversations that are playing out in select boards, with foresters who manage public land, with nonprofits who manage outdoor recreation centers. And this is something that people are talking about and making decisions about now as they think about some of the critical issues that their communities are facing. And we want to provide them with the best available information about what it looks like when you make these decisions. We also want to try to answer questions that communities have as they emerge. So another community that was in this initial study group, they, partway through came to us and said, we're really worried that we have a lot more cyclists on the road now. And we also have a lot of logging trucks on the road. And we don't know where we should be worrying about collision. It seems dispersed. we could go to the select board and ask for bike lanes, but we don't know where the best place to put them would be. And that's a place where I can be helpful, right? Because I'm, as a research scientist, good with data, and I have graduate students who have hours to fill. And so we're actually able to get data from the activity tracker app Strava, which is not popular here, but is very popular in New England, or at least it's not as popular here. And then we can actually see like where the cyclists are and what time of day, right? They're recording their rides and uploading them. And then we can pull traffic cam data and overlay it with that Strava data. And we were able to say to this community, hey, as you're growing, we think you need to be thinking about bike lanes in these locations. And we can see that like the times of day that you should really need to worry about having logging trucks and mountain bikers like in the same places are Sunday afternoon at whatever. I don't remember the actual pinch point. But the other thing that I think we're hoping to do is help with decision making, right? Provide support to decision making as communities are wrestling with some of these tough choices.
This change that you're describing, there are a number of different stakeholders that are driving it, and at different parts of the process. I would imagine you talk about maybe the gentrification that can come with the housing market. That would just sort of be like that is a market. You can talk about the cycling trails being developed. I would imagine that is largely down to either it's people who live there doing it sort of guerrilla, or it's down to whoever owns and controls the land. And then what you were just describing there, do we need more road infrastructure? I would imagine that comes down to some kind of, I don't know whether it's a state or a local level government, probably both depending on where a thing falls. How do you coordinate all that? How do we as a society coordinate all of that? I imagine that is where you come in.
Yeah, I think that's really the heart of what I'm interested in as a researcher is how do we manage resources and benefit from resources across land ownership, land tenure, jurisdiction, decision making. And it's very difficult. And so I think it's played out differently in every community that I've gone to and that I've talked to. And, you know, in addition to there being sort of different locuses of control and different folks in decision making, communities are not monoliths. So there's often also disagreement about where there should be investment, where there shouldn't be investment, if there should be investment, if this should even be a strategy, right? There's people in every one of these communities that we've gone to that have not liked this idea, that don't want an influx of people from away, right? And would prefer if the community looked the way it did 10 and 20 years ago and don't want to see substantial change. And so I think that is very difficult and challenging. And I don't envy town planners and city planners for having to balance all of those different competing stakeholder groups. I think my role is providing examples of how things play out under different circumstances and providing information about what's happening on the ground so that those decision makers can make their choices, make management decisions with the best available information at the time that they're making the decision.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. Support and grow our nonprofit newsroom project today at chly.ca/donate with a monthly or one-time donation. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
How do forested communities change when those forests start getting really popular for recreation? That's the kind of question Kim Coleman studies. She's a professor at the University of Vermont, but she's spending a season on Vancouver Island as a Fulbright Canada Research Chair at VIU. She joined me in the CHLY studio Tuesday. How do you approach doing that work? It's one thing you're a professor at the University of Vermont. How do you approach coming into another place on the other side of the continent and looking at other communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's very tricky because also I'm here for a very short period of time. So I'm relying heavily on great colleagues at VIU to tell me who to talk to and introduce me to folks and tell me ideas of where they think I should go. And that's been really helpful. That's one of the wonderful things about being a Fulbright scholar. It's this program that's run through the U.S. State Department, and they have relationships with countries all over the world, and they place you at an institution that's going to be a good fit for you, where you're going to have colleagues that can help you with those connections. The reason that I really wanted to come here over, I don't know, say Sweden, is that very much like New England, there's a long history of both the timber industry and small rural communities that are dependent on that, and also a rich history of outdoor recreation and the marketing of outdoor recreation and in specific mountain biking. So in many ways, there are parallels. And then anytime that's the case, anytime that there are parallels and yet key differences, there's opportunity to learn lessons by comparison. And so that's really the goal here, is to say, what does BC have to teach Northern New England, and what does Northern New England have to teach BC in terms of how these stories have maybe played out in similar ways and in key different ways.
Is there something that you feel like from the work you've done in Northern New England, is there something you feel like is a lesson, is a key takeaway? You have done all this work and you're talking with someone in a pub and they're like, well, what do you do? And this is the fun fact you always go to?
That's interesting. The thing that I'll say is that I think the housing crunch has been really tight in Northern New England. And I think that is I'm starting to hear stories of, or not I'm starting to hear, I've hardly been here that long, but I'm hearing stories that sound like the beginning of that curve here, right? Folks who used to live in Vancouver, for example, who have moved maybe to Nanaimo or to somewhere else on the island because they want to be in a more rural place where they can play where they live, right? And have access to outdoor recreation infrastructure more easily. I've heard that story a couple times, and I've heard people say like, yeah, it's getting more expensive to live here. And so I think that's something that has played out in New England potentially ahead of, I'm not an economist and I don't study the housing market, so maybe I'm wrong about this, but that sort of trend seems like maybe there's something to learn there about how that's played out in New England. I think another thing that I'm really interested in, mountain biking has been popular here for a long time, and it's been popular in New England for a long time, but not the way it has been here. And I don't think that Northern New England has successfully marketed that the way that BC has. And so I'm curious to learn, how communities here have been able to leverage that successfully and build actually the vibrant forest communities that we would hope to see in Northern New England, right? How do we achieve that goal? How have places here been able to do that?
You are a mountain biker yourself.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about maybe, first of all, just your experience of the trails since moving here?
Yeah, absolutely. They're different. So I'll say that for folks listening who also might be mountain bikers, I'm very much of the cross-country mountain biker variety. So I still have SPD pedals and I clip in, and I'm completely kitted out in spandex and have a very short travel front fork. Like I think it's like 120.
Could you translate some of that into non-mountain biker?
Yeah, totally. I'm the person that's into the uphill, right? I'm not flying down a speedy downhill and like launching off jumps. I'm very much look like people who were mountain biking like in the early 2000s. And I still have a very like endurance racy looking bike. So I would say the mountain biking here is really different. It's super fun. I got a chance to ride a couple of places around Nanaimo before the snow came down, and your trails are really tight compared to East Coast trails, and there's some big scary stuff that I just don't look at. But otherwise, I've had a really nice time, and I'm excited to explore other places. Everyone keeps giving me recommendations of places to go, so hopefully by May I'll have like a whole list of the best spots on the island.
And you have talked about this idea of marketing mountain biking. Mm-hmm. How do you look at that as someone who is both a scholar and someone who enjoys doing the hobby?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm not I don't research marketing, but I'll say that I think a lot of the communities here and at home that I have visited, that's something that they're really thinking about. How do we package an experience of this place? How do we attract people who might want to visit, but also who might, want to have a certain lifestyle, right? I think I'm seeing that in both places, that communities, they want to be the type of place that provides a great mix of, restaurants, coffee shops, really amazing opportunities for outdoor recreation, jobs, good housing, all in one little package. And I think that I'm seeing that as different than, for example, ski resort marketing, where it's really marketed towards people to like come, have a vacation, and go home. I think this is a different flavor of trying to attract people, maybe to relocate to an area based on a certain lifestyle. My graduate student has been calling it lifestyle migration.
And off the top of our conversation, again, we talked about you mentioned that it's sort of like a mixed bag. You could describe the changes that we see in communities when this kind of thing happens, that on the positive side, maybe there are new businesses starting to open up. It feels like a bit of life has maybe returned, or a bit of new life has sprung forth in some of the communities. But also you talked about how people could be pushed out of the community if they can't afford the housing. Their children can't afford the housing, maybe, say, for example. What do we do beyond, say, like, okay, yep, that's happening? Is there like some kind of way where we can mitigate maybe the negative consequences while still experiencing the positive?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We've talked a lot about the need for infrastructure of many types to be scaffolded. I think it's really hard for communities to do that. So to think about, okay, if we're going to say we want to build some amenity that's going to attract people from away, well, we need to be prepared for those people to come here. We need roads that can handle an influx. We need maybe bike lanes and maybe stoplights. And we need to make sure that we have the housing stock available. We need to have a school that's big enough and enough teachers employed. To do all of that in like a real concerted way is very hard, right? And if it wasn't tricky, the communities would be doing it. It costs money. That's like the bottom line, right? I would imagine
you don't get the money until the people come, and then you've got to go through this phase where there are just too many people for the roads that exist, and there's this real tension.
Yeah, and so it's growing pains, right? It's this like scaling up, building the ship while you're flying it sort of situation, and there's going to be winners and losers in those situations inevitably. So you'll have folks who really don't want to see what has been their dirt road with hardly any cars on it paved and turned into a bigger road that has, bike lanes and a lot more traffic on it and people parking on the shoulder. And at the same time, if you don't have those new people come in, well, maybe you don't keep your school open because you don't have enough kids to go there and enough tax base to pay your teachers. And so we're seeing those kinds of problems butt up against each other in many of these towns that we're looking at, where they're really at this point of needing to make a choice of how they're going to stay vibrant, if they're going to stay vibrant, and what they might be willing to lose, or what they will lose even if they're not excited about it, given the change that's going to happen, right?
I feel like I can't have a conversation about mountain biking changing a community, the face of a community on Vancouver Island, without mentioning Cumberland specifically. Has the town's reputation preceded it? Have you heard of it? Have you made plans to visit, checked it out already?
Yeah, I haven't been there yet, but everybody has told me that I have to put it on my list. So I will definitely go. And I think that story is really resonates with me of, an early beginning. Usually the trails are sort of community built, grassroots, maybe without permission. That was really common in the early days of mountain biking, to have rogue trails. And that definitely, I think, still happens. However, now that we have examples like Cumberland of places that have seen this increase in tourism and that have created maybe, a little community that people want to live in, that has this great lifestyle to offer, that attracts people, there are other communities that are seeking to emulate that, right? And there's a corollary in Vermont, Kingdom Trails, which is a collection of like over 200 landowners that pooled their land, like individual landowners like you and me, not like a big forest company, but just like private people, pooled their land and built this extensive network of trails. And it's a very remote place. It's far from any major highway in Vermont. It's in a part of the state called the Northeast Kingdom that we think of as like, it's almost Canada. It's almost here. It's almost Quebec. And it's not easy to get to. But people just started hearing about this trail network, word of mouth. And a lot of folks actually came from Quebec and rode there. And then it started growing in popularity. If you were to Google it after this program, you'd find New York Times articles about it, because as it grew in popularity, these tensions that we're talking about started emerging, right? And on the one hand, there's all of this growth and vibrancy that comes up, new businesses, B&Bs, a whole nonprofit formed to manage the trails. They have attracted people from all over, hosted huge mountain bike festivals, and there's, a range of tension. So one of the landowners pulled out. That creates a whole difficulty around managing across land ownership and tenure. So I think there's these communities in both northern New England and here on the island that have, like, quote unquote made it, right? Like, and they're the ones that we hold up and say, wouldn't it be great if other communities could follow in their footsteps? And really our role as researchers are to say, like, what's worked and what hasn't worked. So how do we support decision makers, and planners as they're thinking about this revitalization of these towns?
You're here through this spring studying at Vancouver Island University. When that time is over, what do you hope you're going to be taking away as research, and what do you hope you're going to be contributing to the community here and leaving us with?
Yeah. So I'm hoping to write a case study. I think there's always a question of, like, who will read that, right? They're very academic. And so I'm always trying to think about what is the way to share it back with the communities that I've worked in. And we've had good luck doing webinars, going back to communities and doing presentations in person. So I hope to do more of that type of work in addition to the academic writing.
In the VIU kind of press release about your scholarship, your coming here to research, you mentioned there was a quote from you. It said, when we compare the BC context to New England, Canada is in a really different place around truth and reconciliation, land rights, land tenure, and the overall context of land ownership and land management between the two countries. Could you give me an idea about those different contexts? Yeah.
In both places, I think that what we think about in terms of land ownership and land access are very different. Additionally, there are Indigenous communities that are, part of this work and part of these communities in both locations, and their ability to manage sovereign or ceded land is very different because there's two different federal governments involved, right? And the United States hasn't gone through truth and reconciliation the way that Canada has. And so just because the laws are different, and just because who has jurisdiction and who has decision-making power changes a lot of those planning elements and planning decisions. In some cases, trail networks cross public, private, Indigenous land. In some cases, they're all one land owner. Of course, when it's one landowner, then decision-making and planning is much easier. And BC has a lot, I think, to teach Northern New England in that context, because I think we haven't had mountain biking as long, and we haven't had mountain biking across so many land ownership types for as long. And so some of that is, the struggle of trying to plan in New England is figuring out, like, okay, well, how's it going to work if we're going to have a private nonprofit building trail on public land? What's that relationship going to look like? How do we do that well? Whereas there's lots of cases of that here.
Is there anything else you feel like it's important to bring to the conversation, or anything you'd like to highlight to the public about your work?
Just that you live in a place with really beautiful forests, and I hope you get to recreate on the trails here, whether it's on a bike or not. I think the focus of this has really heavily been on mountain bike infrastructure and mountain bike trails, but the truth is that a lot of the trails that get built for mountain bikers get used by a lot more non-mountain bikers than mountain bikers, right? So we'll see a trail get built that's mountain bike specific, and then hear like the most of the people that are using it are kids walking to school on the trails. So I hope all of the listeners here realize that those trails are for you too, and get out and enjoy them and explore them and see the world around you.
Kim Coleman, thank you so much for coming to the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
Kim Coleman is a professor at the University of Vermont. She's spending the spring at Vancouver Island University as a visiting Fulbright Canada Research Chair. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and R.B. Frew, our technical advisor. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band, Waste Management. Get in touch at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.